Section 3.2.7-T. Stocks may be categorized by sectors. The accompanying data represent the one-year rates of return for a simple random sample of financial stocks and energy stocks. The data represent the one-year rate of return in percent for a sample of consumer cyclical stocks and industrial stocks for a 12-month period. Note that consumer cyclical stocks include restaurants and retailers. Industrial stocks include manufacturers and shipping companies. We're going to complete parts A through C below. So for part A, they want us to draw a relative frequency histogram for each sector using a lower class limit for the first class of -50 and a class width of 10. Which sector appears to have more dispersion. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our data into StatCrunch. So we're going to click on the data here, and then we're going to take this data set and open it up in StatCrunch. So now that we have this data open up in StatCrunch, we want to be able to go ahead and graph. And so we're going to select graph, go down to histogram, and we're going to start with the first one, which is cyclic. So in this case here, we're looking for a relative frequency histogram. So the type we need to make sure that we change to a relative frequency. We know that the first class is going to start at -50, and we know that the class width, which is what they're asking us to put in, is 10. And so then we're going to go ahead and then select compute. So therefore, there is our relative frequency for our first histogram. So let's go ahead and then create the other histogram. So we're going to select histogram again. Now we're going to go with the industrial. Again, we need to make sure that it's a relative frequency. We're starting at -50. And then our class width is at 10. So we're going to select compute. Okay, so now the question asked us is that which sector appears to have more dispersion? So now we can answer that by looking at the graph, but the range can be clearly seen using these two histograms. So the histogram with the largest range is going to show the most dispersion. Okay, now we can find the range if we wanted to of these two. We can go to Stat, go to Summary Stat, select Columns, and go ahead and select both. And then we can find the range by computing that. And then we can see that the cyclic has more of a range than the industrial. And you can see that the range, this is more spread out than the industrial. Now, you want to be able to look at the graph and already see that it's more spread out here than it is for the industrial. But that's one way of being able to determine that, is by looking at the range. Now, what we want to do is we want to be able to determine the mean and the median rate of return for each sector, and which sector has the higher mean rate of return and which sector has the higher median rate of return. So we're going to go back to StatCrunch, and we're going to go ahead and select Summary Stats again. So we're going to go to Stat, Summary Stat, select Columns. We're going to do both. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to select the mean and the median. So what we can see here is that for the cyclic sector, it has a sample mean of 6.996. And then it also has a median of 0.55. And then we can see that the mean and median for the industrial sector So for the industrial sector, we have a sample mean of 14.705, and we have a median of 11.85. So the industrial sector has the higher mean and median rate of return according to our data. Okay, and now we're going to determine the standard deviation rate of return for each sector. And in finance, the standard deviation rate of return is called risk. Typically, an investor pays for a higher return by accepting more risk. Is the investor paying for higher returns for these sectors? So we're going to go back to our data on StatCrunch. We're going to go ahead and select Stat, select Summary Stats, and then go to Columns. Again, we're going to select both columns, and we're looking for the standard deviation. So we're going to go ahead and compute. And so what can we determine from here? Well, we can see that the cyclic standard deviation, or the sample standard deviation, rounded to 3 decimal places, is 19.986. And the sample standard deviation for the industrial is 19.549. And you can see here that if we round it to 3 decimal places, we get 19.549. So the question now says that the sector that has the higher sample standard deviation has the most at risk. And so recall that the industrial sector has the higher mean and median rate of return, and comparing the two standard deviations to determine if the investor is paying for higher rates of return for the industrial sector. So we can say that the investor is paying for a higher return for the sector with the higher median rate of return.